Good evening, dear friends of design. It feels like it's been a pretty long time since I've been able to address anyone in the design event, and even today we're once more having a virtual event and gathering, which I presume will be joined by approximately some almost 100 people from Finland, and guess who knows actually where some of our guests tonight will be. But most of our presentations will be coming today from around the Helsinki region here in southern Finland. I'm also personally just short distance away from the Qvik headquarters in Kamppi, where you'll hear a couple of our awesome presenters later on in the stream. So welcome everyone to this Inclusive by Design. My name is Lassi Liikkanen. I have the honor to be kind of giving this very short opening for this event. I'm currently the product design director at Qvik. We have a very nice group, about like 20 designers working with me or with Qvik overall. And I have personally been at Qvik about 3 years, now at this role about 7 months or something like that. And this is the first event in a very long time for us. So please excuse us if something goes a little bit funny during this presentation. I'm just going to say a few words about what is Qvik. As some of you may know, we've been around about 13 years, and some of you may have had the opportunity to attend our meetups and other events in the past. We represent altogether about 100 people. Our design department or group is about 20 people. We operate mostly in Helsinki, but we also got a few great designers situated in Stockholm. Last year, our company size is approximately about 10 million euro turnover, which makes us kind of a medium-sized Finnish technology company. What else? As a company, Qvik is currently focused on providing the best consumer experiences to help create a successful business for our customers. And that's also kind of key thing when you think about why we do design, because we think that in order to provide successful consumer services, we need to kind of combine the understanding about people, consumer insight, design, human-centric design, and of course, modern technology. This is kind of what we believe in. We have, I'd say, nowadays we have pretty much like a full stack of different type of design services at our disposal. We do things from the very beginning: business design, service design, UX design, whatnot. We are, of course, also considerate about inclusive design and accessibility, but our principles when it comes to thinking about how we think about design and these themes is that we try to do services that are inclusive and accessible by default, not an afterthought. We're not a company that actively just does accessibility or usability testing. No, we are a company that moves on to do solutions. And of course, final thing, the commercial information is that we're hiring. We're of course always interested to find out more great people, designers to work with both here in Helsinki and also in Stockholm. So if you're thinking about a next change in your career, please check out our careers page at qvik.com. And that's about that. I'm going to stop and we'll let the actual experts take the show from here on. But one more thing is that you also, your audience, have a role to play in this game, and that is that wherever you're watching, you can comment and ask questions during the presentations, and then we will have about 4 or 5 minutes preserved after each and every talk, so that we will go through a couple of the questions and have the presenter respond. Then we're going to have also some time reserved after all the 4 presentations are over to have more like a common discussion, and then we can resurface some of the questions which we didn't have enough time in before. That's pretty much it. That's how we're going to roll. So we're going to have 4 presenters, starting from Jesse, the thunder of Käpylä, Ukkonen, our own senior product designer. He's going to start the show. Then we're going to hear from Jonna Tötterman. She's here mostly for her role as a co-founder for the Design for Children's Rights organization. She will be followed by Sanna Rauhala. design anthropologist at Solita, a very well-known technology company. And then we're going to have very interesting final presentation from Yesmith Sánchez. She's a DEI consultant and Inklusiiv, which I think she will describe a little bit more detail because it's an interesting combination of an NGO and a company. And now back to Jesse and to Qvik.
Thank you, Lassi. And just a moment. Now I won't hear my own voice. So thank you for being here today. As Lassi mentioned, my name is Yesmith Ukkonen, and I'm a senior product designer here at Qvik. And I'm going to share some thoughts about good design today. And my focus is on the inclusive and the intersectional parts of design. And just a disclaimer, you are probably going to hear some of these terms and concepts echoing in the upcoming keynotes as well. But fear not, they will complement each other and they will bring some new perspective for you. And I think we will all deepen our understanding of inclusive design in general today. But let me first start off with briefly defining 2/3 of my presentation's title. And just a general note, I'm looking everything from a designer's perspective. So that's my kind of view and take on this. But by inclusive, I mean something that is open to everyone and something that is not limited to certain people, whether that's knowingly or unknowingly. And intersectionality for me is the notion that we have characteristics and identities that overlap and also intersect with one another. So, for instance, a white woman experiences world differently than a woman of color who is also a mother. So there are many interactions and kind of intersections at play here. And both of these concepts are needed to make good design. We often talk about a generic user in software development. Sanna will probably tell us more about that, but for now, let's remember that a universal user does not really exist. They're actually human beings. Great revelation. And there is no human being that would be same throughout their life. This illustration from Microsoft Inclusive Toolkits says it all, really. The usage of digital services often depends on what we see, what we can hear, what we can say and touch. And just like we have overlapping personal features, we also have limitations that depend on different situations. So, for instance, text content and user interface elements like buttons that are easy to understand, that they have good contrast and support for screen readers benefit all, whether I would be in a noisy and shaky bus on my way to home or just tired and stressed out at 5 p.m. with all the webinars and remote meetings that I've had today. So what I'm saying as well is that we all get older. We are sometimes broken, both physically and mentally, and we need to take that into account when we design things for human beings. A common definition of disability is that is something that occurs when our needs and the environment that is human built are not aligned. That's a good definition. And it applies to physical spaces as well as digitals. So if I would be in a wheelchair and could not access a building, or if in a physical space I would be a non-binary person and I would be offered toilets for only men or women, I would not have access to these spaces. So oftentimes it's the environment and its design that create inequality. And it's our job to correct these different kinds of mismatches. Here's one example of a mismatch in the digital world. It's a classic accessibility issue. So a person who can see will understand that this button here will submit their job application on a website. A blind person, on the other hand, will hear voiceover tell that this is a button that is called button 1. On a site that would be filled with these kinds of elements, they would probably leave the site frustrated and wouldn't apply for the job because that site wasn't accessible for them. But there's more. There are, of course, a lot of other mismatches as well. And many of these are maintained and sustained by our society. This particular example on a Finnish dating site is both inaccessible and exclusive. However, I must point out and assume that this is probably also a conscious strategic choice that limits the audience of this particular service. But judging by the screenshot, the audience or the target customers might be either men or women who are looking for either men or women. They are probably cisgendered and perhaps monogamous. And judging by the gallery of images in the background, it's visually hinted that you might be better off if your skin is white. This is, of course, a glaring example, but it delivers the point, and I'm all about points. Of course, this wouldn't be a real keynote with at least one maturity framework. So here are a few of the essential terms that, in my opinion, describe the road on which we've been in the past years. The first one is compliancy. So these are more or less the rules written in stone, or at least in hard code. So the laws, the WCAG criteria, the EU Accessibility Directive. Oftentimes these compliancy items might be quite difficult to understand and interpret. And what we need to remember is that a technically compliant website or an app is not necessarily accessible for actual human beings. That's where accessibility comes in. So that's the process that will take us to an end result. And the end result is a product that can be used by people with different disabilities. And to achieve this, we try to be compliant and follow the requirements and legislation. And of course, an accessible product is one of the outcomes of inclusive design, which is more of a methodology. For me, inclusive design is the principle that as many people as possible can use your product. It's the notion that anyone can be excluded depending on the situation and the circumstances. So this is not just a question of disabilities or limitations. So when we design with inclusivity in mind, we take into consideration different kinds of people and their differing ways to use your product. So for instance, I might think, how do people who cannot see or hear use it, the accessibility point, or how do people of color experience your product? How do people with various gender or sexual identities experience your product? So this way, we will have an accessible end result by default, but we don't stop there. So this is not just about ability, but it's also relatability and desirability, just like any good experience design, really. Of course, there's no talk about inclusion and intersectionality without a word or two about diversity, which is a diverse topic. It's diversity of the mind, of the gender, of lived experiences, the color of your skin, the social class. And when we create products, we might only consider a few of these dimensions that are easy for us to define and just call it a day. But in order to do better work, we need to dig deeper, and we need to consider things such as education, on culture, and geography. For instance, remote working in Lapland is different from on-site working as a tram operator in Helsinki. That also affects to the needs that you have towards a service, for instance. And you might or you must think, for instance, how life would be more difficult or easy for a person, for a customer who is a brown-skinned woman with a child, or how would that experience translate to a white man in his 50s who is a queer person. So these combinations are not fictional or unlikely, but they are real people with real needs. And what we should do is to observe our customers and users and fellow human beings through these different lenses of diversity. So if we think about an athlete, a white Finnish 20-year-old male student can be an athlete, and a dark-skinned British immigrant mother in their 40s might be an athlete. Either of them might have a disability on top of that. So what I'm asking is, which of the athletes would you be designing for? Could it be possible that you are looking athletes through a narrow lens that is obscured by stereotypes? And importantly, are you at risk to exclude an existing and growing group of customers? Another way to put it, intersectionality means that people have more than one identity. Yet another way to put it, as a designer, as a product owner, as a stakeholder, I want to, of course, know my customers. And in order to really understand the diversity of our customers, we need intersectionality as a tool. And we need to use it as a tool to expose and understand the individuals beyond just hard data and market analysis. Senongo Akpem has really brilliantly described how our biases play a part in these different challenges. That's the concept of weird cultures that he describes in his book, Cross-Cultural Design. Weird, of course, means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed. And one of the pitfalls for a weird designer living in that kind of a culture is to assume that all or most of their users come from similar backgrounds and places as well. And this way we are further excluding a great number of non-weird people from our services, or at least make them feel unwelcomed. And people from weird cultures usually have certain assumptions about culture and gender and context of use. So we might be designing for Christian people who are either men or women using personal mobile devices with fast internet and usually live a carefree everyday life. That's why I want to come back to diversity, or more the lack thereof. These are just a few of the companies and the people behind it that came first to my mind when thinking about founders and leaders and tech companies. And quite frankly, these are also some of the people that have had a huge impact in creating and influencing our digital environment. And as we know, the majority of the tech community suffers from a diversity deficit, and the internet reflects this imbalance, more or less. Affinity bias is really what it sounds like. We gravitate towards people that are like ourselves. And we are also more likely to have empathy towards people who are like us. And in a business or professional setting, when people around you are not that different from each other, it's really important to shake yourself a bit and think again. Why do I always ask design feedback from those two colleagues who just happen to like yoga like me? Or why would I think that a candidate would be a good addition to our team? Am I looking for a culture fit or a culture add? So it's mostly becoming aware of my biases and kind of thinking, why do I think the way I do? These are big questions, but I'm going to leave this here on the table for you. Let's zoom out a bit and look at another big picture. Two things are highlighted in this illustration. One is that the product team rarely represents the whole user base and its diversity. And this is also reflected in what kinds of design and business decisions are made. You know, like I said, I'm just a designer. I'm not really a business person, but I can figure out this much. The more people you reach, the more you increase your market share. And thus we cover more area from the pyramid, which is good, right? We want to cover more area. We want to cover more people. And just like we should make accessibility a part of the way we do things around here, intersectionality should be addressed already when we are forming the product strategy, the vision, the roadmap. And when we admit that we all have different identities that affect us, we inevitably start thinking about how to make our product open to everyone and not just a limited group of people. So this is about educating ourselves. It's about stepping out from our personal reality and to stop seeing the world only through its lens. And people who have different life experiences, different backgrounds, different overlapping identities, hire them, work with them, listen to them, bring them into the fold and into your design process. And it's obvious that when a diverse group of people assembles and work, they will simply make your product better. And that's when innovation happens. And most probably more people will want to use your service because it's created by a team that better reflects the society in which we all live. It's simple as that. Well, in theory, at least. So here's a few things that helped me to think with inclusivity and intersectionality in mind. I hope they will be of some use for you as well. One is that I shouldn't assume. We are influencing people's everyday lives quite often, and that's why we cannot afford to shoot from the hip when we are making assumptions about our end users. It wasn't that long ago when design was just about making things pretty and polished. We have a much more bigger responsibility now. For instance, I would like to start any new project with an interview round of different kinds of customers and also stakeholders, because we always make assumptions and we have biases. We shouldn't be ashamed of those, because that's just a part of humanity. But what is important is to validate and expose those assumptions as early as possible. Just like with any design, fail fast, fail early. And be holistic. When we are holistic, we don't just look at the compliance level with all the laws and requirements and checklists. So try to map the permanent and the situational contexts. Storyboard with different kinds of personas and think about how to maintain the same quality experience for all of your users. And what you as an individual can do is to look within. That's what I started with. Learn what kinds of cognitive biases you might have, how structural oppression might affect you or might not affect you. This is also why we should engage with different kinds of people, to listen rather than to preach. And the goal of inclusive design is not to try to design for every single person on this planet, but it's about recognizing how diverse a set of people can be, a small set even. So know who your users are in the society, know in what ways they can be different from each other, and understand how it affects their needs. I guess just one more bottom line. We create solutions to complex problems, designers, developers, everyone in the tech community. And inclusive and intersectional design is not an either-or situation. You don't ask your customer whether they want to drink or eat in order to live, right? The same way, it's not impossible to ask that a product would have a good general user experience and that it could be used by different kinds of people. It's our job to do this right and help each other to get there. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Now I am looking at the comments section. Can't see anything over there, but luckily we will have some great keynotes here, and
there's more content coming in. I also have a question for you. Yes, although now I realize that we have a problem because Jesse can't hear me due to the fact that
Now I
he's
can hear you.
he's wearing headphones. Yeah, he kind of overcame the technological restrictions of the stage area. Yeah, I wanted to actually ask a question. A lot of very kind of interesting ideas yesterday, what you presented, and I think those will probably kind of tickle everyone's brain for a little while. But I actually wanted to kind of, you presented this kind of very high level overview of what you can do. I wanted to kind of ask about your kind of personal experiences and kind of approach, because I know that you've been a year ago when we had previous event around accessibility, you were presenting stuff that you had been working with the Finnish railway company VR, and particularly some kind of special solutions that have been developed over there to say increase inclusivity by creating some accessible features. Now you're working with, in a kind of different, but still like I'd say like general population level service. And I mean, how do you kind of currently think about when you're starting a new as a designer? We know that people do kind of move around, particularly during the pandemic. A lot of people have switched jobs. And what do you think is the kind of a good approach whenever you kind of begin with a new project, new digital service? What would you do first in order to figure out that what should be done, or is there anything to be done to improve the inclusivity of this particular design?
That's a good question. What I would probably do is to go around and ask silly questions as much as possible, because I might not have the assumption at first hand that what we could do to improve the inclusivity. But what I would like to first do is to kind of mandate that, hey, I want to talk with people from development team, people from marketing, from communications, and I would kind of like to have the access to some customer feedback, and I would do my own research, maybe from social media, or kind of seeing what people are talking about when it comes to this particular product or feature or service. And I don't know, it's a fertile environment when you are stepping into a new project. You are kind of looking at it from a user's perspective, and sometimes as a designer I might be diving right into the solution phase or the problem definition space. But what I try to kind of always embrace is that kind of childlike moment when I don't know anything and I am open to everything. So maybe those kinds of things, and perhaps have a talk with some of my friends, some of my fellow colleagues who might have kind of different life experiences and different takes on the service, and kind of hear their unfiltered feedback.
Cool. I will bother you with a kind of follow-up question still. That say that you found yourself in a situation where you've just recently started with a new thing you're working on, and then you discover that there's something really kind of a something that really bothers you in terms of inclusivity, for instance. What do you think? How would you? I'm not sure if this question can be answered, but is there any kind of good general advice how you, as an individual designer who has concerns about the fact that this is not going to be good for a certain group of people, how you should kind of move on and try to kind of get that thing fixed?
Well, the good thing as a designer and as a consultant is that I'm not there to be friends with the customer. It's my job to raise these concerns. If I would see that a button or layout looks wrong and it just doesn't feel right, or the mobile width is not working and the responsive design is not working, or something like that, I would raise that up. Similarly, if I would see exclusive design patterns, I would raise those up, but in a way that I would kind of I would see and I would present it as a problem for the user and for the customer, and kind of get the discussion going from that. So not in a blaming way or accusing way, but more in a how might we fix this together and how might we work this out.
Great. That sounds like a feasible approach. And now we actually have a follow-up question, which we will save for the later discussion after 6:30. Sorry, Mikael. I think we need to kind of get Jonna on stage. So thanks so much, Jesse.
Thanks, Mikael. And thank you, Jonna. I will now give the stage to you.
Thank you.
Have at it.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So I'm Jonna Tötterman, and I'm from the Designing for Children's Rights organization. And yeah, thanks. My slides are there. So we are a big group of international community, and there is over 280 people currently all over the world involved in this Designing for Children's Rights community. And from this map, you can see that the participants are from Northern America to Southern Africa to Australia to the northernest location, which is Helsinki. I'm one of the co-founders, and I'm today going to talk about how can we make more human future when we consider how can we consider children's point of view. And what is the underlying background or thinking in our work is that we make the change. We adults of today, we make the decisions that define tomorrow and the future. And based on the United Nations definition, everyone between 0 to 18 years old are children. And this means that when you design experiences and realize that children are actually your stakeholders, the time frame changes. The perspective of the impact changes. It's not anymore a few years. It can be 70 years to 90 years and so on. And when you actually design human experiences with children, you actually may create like childhood memories that are key moments, both in good and in bad. But this is something also Jesse was mentioning, that when we design for humans, we need to understand many aspects. We need to understand the emotional point of view, the cognitive aspects, the motivation, preferences, the social, cultural point of views, and so on, so that we can make great experiences and great products. And usually our decisions are not aimed to harm, and we want to do good. But the problem is that we are faulty, and we have the mental heuristics, Jesse was also mentioning, that are prone to multiple biases. So, for example, naive realism that makes us think that everybody have the same experience of the world than we have. And often the harm is not intentional, it's unintentional, it's not intentional. It emerges when the diseases are colored. We are not aware. We have biased data. Our incentives and metrics are guiding the behavior to wrong direction, and so on. And this, I think, is key message in many presentations today, that the stereotypical human is often in design and in business is perceived as a healthy adult who is alone. And it's often also male, but most of all, adult who is alone. So the family, the parent perspective, or the child, the people under 18 are excluded from the thinking. So we are in our individualistic in our individualistic culture, we are focusing on the individual, the user, the customer, the consumer. We are talking about segmentations of users. We want to know how big groups we have a specific type of users or customers. But we are not thinking about the social structures or the interconnections and impacts that there are between the users and the people around them. So what I try to say is that our perspective is often too narrow and the time scale is too short. We are focusing on the near future and we are not thinking the long-term impacts. So we are excluding children And this seems to be systemic bias. It happens in many actions. And the problem of excluding children is that we do not just exclude a group of humans, but also the long-term, the future thinking from our project and from our business decisions. And designing for children should not be something you do after everything is done. Should not be an afterthought. It should be considered during the process. So the scope is big, and so is the responsibility. If you think from the Finnish perspective, like fifth of the Finnish population are under 18. So there are over 1 million children in Finland. And if you look at the families, there are almost like 560,000 families in Finland. And 80% of these families have at least 2 parents. And then in global scale, 25% of the global population, they are children, they are under 18. But then on a global scale, it's also different that 1 in 4 under 5-year-olds are actually not officially registered. So we don't know enough about them. And the thing is that the world is not designed for children or with the child-centric mindset. If you think about city planning or traffic or daily routines or internet, social media, these are not designed for children or children as the key stakeholder. For example, the most common internet browsers are not designed for children, even though there are like every one in 3 internet user is a child. And one example is also the World Happiness Report. And I think this is good for Finland as well, to remember that we have been celebrating that we are the happiest country in the world for several years repeatedly. But then children under 15 years old are not included in the survey. And if you look at other surveys where children are included, Finland is actually ranking in 26th or 12th or 16th or in the happiness level. So there is actually very little link between the satisfaction between children's and adults' experiences. And this is something that it is silly that we celebrate something that is not actually talking about the whole population and the experience of the whole population. And when we talk about just the consumer and user point of view, then on the market that is mainly targeted for parents who are the customers, the user experience, as you see, I love this picture. It really highlights how the user experience can be something completely different than the customer experience. So we are living in the era of the customer understanding and insight and the willingness to do customer-centric business. But then the end users might not be the customers. So as I said, yes, excluding children is a systemic bias, and it is actually bad business. It's not smart, and it can be also harmful. Children's rights are relevant for businesses in the Nordics too. Often we think that everything is ready in Finland or other Nordic countries, but children's rights are relevant also in the digital context, and they are relevant in many other aspects, and we are not ready. There's a lot to do. Ensuring the rights of the child is like the baseline, but we should do better, we should do more. And we should actually think about the impacts. We should think about what we expose the children to. Like digital and online services, for example, they create a lot of wonderful experiences and opportunities. But when we exclude children, we don't know what actually is that we are providing, what kind of services we are actually creating. As I mentioned, the internet browsers. So UNICEF has estimated that every 1 in 3 internet users are children. And here are 6 big problems that are relevant in the digital context and in the context of using internet when it's not actually safe for you. So we are talking about, like, are we creating safe or unsafe content? Are there dark patterns? Is there adult content or frightening content for children? And are we creating or providing connection with unsafe or safe contacts? Or is there trusted information, or is there misinformation? Are we helping children to keep control in their life and do other activities as well? Or are we supporting excessive use? And then considering, like, privacy and data aspect, like, is the information understandable? Do we collect data of children and their use? And then the equality. So are there role models for different, for example, in the digital media, are the characters role models for different types of children, or are they clear stereotypes? So not an afterthought. Designing for children should be, by default, children should be considered as key stakeholders always. But then I want to raise another aspect, like not only like the children as users, but also the social perspective that I mentioned already before. That thinking about the impact on the user, but also on the social group of the user. We should, on the research phase, we should understand the social connections. And so also we should be interested in these aspects of social and connections and emotions, and the physical aspect of being close to each other. And also, like, the social architecture. I like this word because it makes you think about when you are creating a digital product for an adult, but if you think about the children that they might be around them, what kind of social architecture is social media creating? Is the parent present, or are they unavailable? And like considering actually the impact in larger scale. So how does a physically present but mentally unavailable guardian affect children? And these are the things that we might not be so, in our cultural situation, might not be so happy to think about, because we live in a cultural state that attention is money and attention is important. But sometimes it's actually better for the user and the consumer to not attend to your product. Here are a couple of pictures of the problems that emerge, that you are not connected to the people around you. How can you maintain friendships and learn to have social connections with your peers if everybody are just looking at their screens? Of course, I'm not saying that the great things cannot happen in the screens. That's the thing. There are opportunities, there are wonderful experiences, but there is also the downside that we need to be aware of. Then I want to just state that it's not simple. There are systemic actors who are involved. So who is responsible? Of course, parents are responsible when you think about children and how to raise children. But then of course, governments are responsible. They need to improve the legislation and all of that. But then companies also have responsibility, and they need to work on that. But then also, we are excluding children and we are excluding the social aspect, but we are also excluding the future. Like, if we think about children, those children that were born last year, they will be 30 in 2051. And they may become, like, for example, grandparents in 2080 or later. And the children of today and the experiences and the society that we give them today become the decision makers. They become the leaders, the employees in 25 and up to that years. And we are influencing on the world that they are then creating. So children are key stakeholders, but they are not yet the decision makers, but they soon will be. So we have the right to talk about the future. And I think this is something that I want to often highlight, is that often future is something that in the business setting, we are afraid to talk about anything else than next 2 years or 5 years. Like everything becomes unknown when you go further and further. But we already know many things that are happening in the world, and future belongs to all of us, and we are collaboratively working towards it. For example, the Earth system crisis is a child rights crisis. The climate change is a child rights crisis. And those are things that we need to be aware of if we are actually really child-centric in our design and in our thinking and in our businesses. For example, there are a lot of children that are exposed to heat waves, water scarcity, air pollution, or lead pollution. And these are the things that might not affect children here in Finland, but then the supply chain that the companies are working here or in the Nordics and EU are actually also involved in some of these topics. But yeah, we are making the future, and we can make the changes. But then how actually to create the more human future? What to do? So we like to say that it's for and with children. So we need to have the child-centric mindset, but we all need to also be able to invite them, make it co-creation with them. And there actually is guidance. UN has published in 2021 this general comment that these 4 rules apply to in general for digital context, that there should be no discrimination. We should think about the best interest of the child, and the children have the right to life, survival, and development. And then we should respect the views of the child. And there are 15 rights that we have designing for children's rights. We have taken into use when we built our guide. And this is one of the main things that we are doing. We are creating collaboratively this open source design guide that is trying to help everybody globally to include children in the decisions and in the business. So I'm presenting here 4 steps what you actually need to do. So we suggest that everybody should form their own ethical guidelines, and we support these 10 principles in help to do that. And these 10 principles include UNICEF's children's rights, the United Nations children's rights. So if you're following these 10, then you're already in a good track of providing better services for children. Then the second step that Jesse was also mentioning, that you need to really understand. You need to understand the users. So from the children's point of view, or in that context, children are not just one user group, nor they are living the same kind of childhood that all us adults have lived. They are individuals, and the childhood changes in time. Children are actually 5 different groups divided by the common developmental stages. And there are like physical development, brain and mind development, and social skills, and then variety of individual differences in interests and health issues and so on. So it's not the common user sort of design, user-centric design that the current sort of design education is including in the curriculum. But then the step 3, we need to understand the stakeholders, the interrelations, direct impact. And I think this is often something missing. So one of the key things when you start a project, if you really try to be child-centric, is to map the stakeholders who are involved and how they are influencing each other. And then the last, participation. So there are a lot of ethical guidelines on how to involve children and how to respect children's views. And that is critical when we are trying to create the child-centric world. And one thing I want to add in the end is that we have different kind of methods also. So one method we have is this worst case scenario builder. that's a matrix that you can use to help imagine different kind of worst cases that you have to be aware when you are thinking about children's perspective. And this is great for co-working sessions, but it's great for also sort of assessing your design after you have made some decisions. But overall, we need to dream, we need to be the change, and the best interest of the child should not be the last thing. It should be the primary consideration, because actually if you design things that are good for children, usually they are good for most of the other users as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonna. That was really insightful. It was actually really nice to see all the kind of different interlinks that we have between our keynotes already now.
Yes.
There is a question coming from Lassi already. Lassi is asking that, are there any studies about the prevalence of children using age-restricted services? What do you think about that?
Well, there are studies, but then there are also like, it's common that children are just, for example, many of them messaging apps may have some kind of age restrictions. And it's because if you have the restriction, then you are not forced to think about the children and children's rights and the impact on children. But the reality is that children are using them anyway. So even though you are trying to exclude children, it doesn't matter, that they will use it anyway. And then sort of that's the problem of like, are you responsible in your decisions and in your business? If you are excluding children, but then they are anyway using it, you are not thinking about the impacts.
That's a good point. And I think children of any people are masters of kind of going around restrictions. So I think we have a lot to learn from them.
Yeah, and it's not only about
something
like,
that I was also thinking when kind of going back to co-creating and participatory design. Design methods oftentimes, like workshops, are kind of like modes of play. So like when we are taking children in the design process, I guess they would be in their natural environment, giving unfiltered feedback and playing with Post-it and stuff like that. So
exactly.
Do you think that we should design more to adults with this kind of child-based or child-first mindset? Would that bring some additional benefits to us all?
I think so. I think like from the accessibility point of view, especially it benefits a lot when you start to think about just the motoric like development or like ability to understand the world around you. And I think it's good to like, I like the idea of giving any product to a toddler, and then you see if it like works. Because they figure out quite fast like what works and what doesn't, and they try out everything, and they are not afraid to break stuff. Adults
true.
are much more like conscious of making a bad image.
Yeah, maybe we should all play and be like children and learn from them more in our everyday lives. I think every parent knows that. Thank you for the lovely presentation, Jonna.
Thank you.
Next up on the stage, we will have Sanna. And
Hi.
I guess I will now leave the stage and give it to you, Sanna, from Solita.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now I have my slides as well. Great. Hi, hello everyone. My name is Sanna and I'm an anthropologist working in design. And this basically means that in the work that I do, be it service design or user experience, strategy or something totally different, I have a high focus on the human experience. And anthropology is the study of what makes us human, which is a broad subject to be sure and not a question easily answered. Just to quickly give you an idea of what anthropology in design is, if we look at the process of design, I usually have 2 feet firmly planted in the messy beginnings, the cultural and the human insights, and then hands basically wherever they are needed. And I'm not an expert in inclusivity, equity, and diversity, especially, unlike the person talking after me, and a lot of other people are specialized in this field, even though it is very near and dear to my heart. But the way I'm approaching the subject, both in my work and life and in this particular talk, is through the lens of the social sciences. In anthropology, when it's the study of what makes us human, it is also what can give us tools to understand that the way I human is not the way everyone else humans, as we've heard in these talks already today. And the world as I experience it is not the same as someone else does. And that is also what my talk is about today, the normal human. Is there one? And what tools we can use to broaden that view. Yes, I already gave great examples on actual digital services that maybe even reinforce that view. And Jonna's talk on designing for children was so important. But just tools by themselves don't really make a master. For that, we need a lot of work. And when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is a lot of work to be done for sure. And that work has been a long process within the discipline of anthropology itself. Just to clarify that I don't see even my beloved discipline as nowhere near flawless. The origins of anthropological fieldwork have been often insightful, sometimes remarkable, and even more often definitely colonialist, sometimes even racist. But I think we have come a long way since then. And I firmly believe that some of the ethical standards that the social sciences hold themselves up to nowadays, or at least try to, is something that has been budding in design for the last decade or so. So when we talk about the lens of social sciences, I should be really talking about lenses, because we all have different roles through which we look at the world, like Jesse said. The way you view people's actions in your role as an activist or an employer or a politician might be totally different than what you would think as a parent, a partner, or even a user of a product, which might be actually a word that we try to steer clear nowadays, even more and more, since being just a user kind of robs the actual person of the context and nuance that we have as people. Because we're never just something, we're the whole complicated, beautiful mess born of this world we live in. And although it's sometimes hard or tricky to understand our differences as people, it's even harder to recognize our own biases, as we've heard many times already today. I think the anthropologist Ruth Benedict summed it up quite well when she said that we do not see the lens through which we look. And in design, I've seen similar quotes saying, I believe, the fish does not see the water in which it swims. And this basically means that we are often blind to the things we are surrounded by, because they seem so everyday and normal to us. And often our habits and rituals are just as strange and unusual to someone maybe looking in from the outside compared to us. Even the ways we use social media and how we post differs hugely around the world. Just to give you a quick example from Finland, kurosailu has been a topic of anthropological research as a very particular ritual that takes place in a certain place in Finland, or a certain part of Finland. I'll use the word hostess here since that is how it was during the time of the study. But kurosailu basically means that during a visit of several people in a home, the hostess tells the guests that the coffee is ready, the food is ready, but no one will be the first to take a place at the table. And this goes back and forth with the hostess trying to convince people to sit down and drink and eat, please, until someone sacrifices themselves while complaining simultaneously, so that it's certain that they in no way volunteered for it. So this is kind of a battle of wills between the hostess and the guests as a way of establishing power hierarchies. And nowadays rituals itself might have changed a bit, but kurusailu itself is still alive and well. Just to give you an idea on how people from other countries, researchers from other countries, see certain Finnish habits. And I guess this is my first actual point. What we consider to be normal is often just our perspective. When you go somewhere else in the world, that perspective might just turn inside out. And like we've already heard, there are so many things in this world that can make us regard some other group of people as the other, not us. It might come down to skin color or ethnicity or religion, gender, sexuality, able-bodiedness, or being differently abled, social status or wealth, or even smelling different. We actually do a lot of our unconscious decisions on people, on how they smell often. Everything and anything. So when we ask who is it hurting, I suppose the answer at some level is everyone. But not everyone suffers the consequences the same way. Maybe the default human mentioned in the topic of this talk as well has long been the Caucasian male, or at least male in design especially, which has been hurtful for pretty much at least half the world's population, even those of us living very privileged lives compared to many others. And people react to the word privilege like it's always an accusation, when usually it's just a fact. It doesn't mean that you face no difficulties in life, or that you should somehow be ashamed. It just means that you have less obstacles in life to begin with. So what does that mean in design? When we talk about digital design, accessibility is the hot ticket, of course, and even that has not been around for a very long time. We already touched quite a bit on that during Jesse's speech, so I won't go further into that. But that's certainly not the only thing connected to inclusivity in design. Let's talk about design research or co-creation, for example. Children were a great example. But even when we claim to delve into the world of the users, in quotation marks, or the people who require the services we create, we often kind of pick and choose. When we talk about groups of people who are difficult to reach and designing services for them, even then we might easily pick the ones from that group that are more palatable to us as people. For example, if we're designing for people who are differently abled, we might pick those that we can interview without too much of a hassle, because it's somehow inconvenient to wait for ages for someone who may have trouble speaking or is in some other way uncomfortable for us personally. And if we need to hear from people who might be homeless or have addictions or are otherwise marginalized, same thing, we easily choose on our terms. I'm definitely not innocent in this myself. In addition to these personal, sometimes even subconscious choices, it can be, when talking about business, it can be time constraints, since some people can be more difficult to reach, convincing someone else that this needs to be done, or feeling like you really don't have the means to reach out. And these are all obstacles, sure. But as people with less obstacles than those we're trying to reach, I suppose we should try just a little bit harder. And maybe to use an example that is not from the digital world. Say you're going to design a well, somewhere that has poor access to water, for example. I suppose many of you just thought of Africa by default. It might as well be rural United States or wherever, but we're so used to seeing Africa represented as a continent that needs to be saved that your mind just easily kind of jumps there. Anyway, you might send in a bunch of engineers and designers. You might implement the best damn well you've ever seen with technical features that even a Japanese toilet would envy, and you go home feeling happy. But then something in the pump breaks. And you have to wonder, does the place that has poor access to water have access to spare parts? Do they have people who know how to use or fix the pump? Did they even lose access to water somewhere else because of your pump? And what happens if and when it breaks? If we don't use our time and effort to understand the context in which we work and the people we are working with and the consequences of those actions, we might be creating something that is at best useless and at worst harmful. Always think of the context. Ignoring the social or physical context, it's not really just bad inclusion practice, it's just bad design in general. But we don't have to go really far to realize that there are people or groups of people in our own environment that we necessarily can't relate to or that we forget. Again, children were a really good example. It might even come down to those seemingly simple things as age or generation. We do talk quite a bit about the struggles of the older generations with technology, which is an immensely important and tough subject. But this time, I think, inspired partly by Jonna, I'm going to use a different example. When I say we, I'm talking about elder millennials, maybe a bit older people that had roughly the same capabilities and possibilities as I did growing up. We also grew up with a certain way of using computers. We learned for the most part to use the clunky boxes that they were at the time. And they had a certain logic to them, which we learned. And our communications online and on the phone were more based on text, like instant messaging, emails, text messages, reading about stuff on web pages full of revolving images of stars and blinking fireworks and God knows what. But that is necessarily not the way the world is for the generation growing up now, people in their teens. When designing public services, for example, we often use the inner logic that kind of we grew up with and is clear and logical to us. We might explain things via a large amount of text. We use attachment, especially when you have to apply for something. But what if your world consists of videos and images and touchscreens and audio? What if you've never had to maybe use that attachment in your life? If so, are you doing something wrong? Are you lacking some skills? Are you being a human being in a wrong way? Or are we as designers maybe lacking the perspective to realize that our way of doing things that we are accustomed to might be foreign to a large part of our audience? This is part of the kind of like the digital native assumption, which is really harmful and a myth among all the others. It means you were born in a certain time, not that you instinctively know how to use information technology. Nor does it mean that you don't know how to use tech if you're older. To say that creates kind of an illusion that all tech is hard to use, and that if you are of a certain age, it is nearly impossible to learn, which it probably is not. It may have been at one time, and you might not want it, and you might not need it. It may be strange, unfamiliar to some, but it doesn't mean that you probably can't do it. Just repeating how hard it is for certain people just creates maybe an expectation of impossibility, even those who might learn it easily. And through that example, I'd like to end by touching on an important part of design and the world that I haven't really talked about yet, which is words. Those pesky little things that not only kind of enable us to share what we think, but that also shape the world around us, because words matter. We learn to use them in a very particular way through the world that we live in, that we grow up in. We learn what is normal. We learn what is taboo, what is forbidden, what we can't say, and what meaning certain words have. And because something has become so embedded in us, in the way that we live in our world, it's sometimes hard to understand that those words have a different meaning to different people, and that they have power over some people that we just can't imagine. And not only that, but by using certain words and rhetoric, we kind of speak into being what we think the world is. And because we don't live in a vacuum, these words also affect people around us and may shape their view of what is normal. Excuse my lighting, I think I would need to stand up and kind of wave around for it to work again, but let's give it a minute. So it's sort of a butterfly effect that keeps on going and going. Like girls can't do math, and big boys don't cry, and you are not fat, you're beautiful, as if you can't be both. They are all very concrete and common and harmful examples of what we think of as the norm or going against the norm. So back to the point of what can we do? I think, as we've heard already today, the first things are to think and to listen. Who are we doing this for? Who is it helping? Who is it excluding? Who can it hurt? And most of all, what is the impact? We like to talk a lot about making an impact, but making an impact is not all that it is. It's also about considering what kind of impact we would be making. This is just one tool we at Solita use for thinking about the impact of our actions and the kind of things that can follow them, both at the personal and the larger societal level. Jonna talked a little bit about the environmental aspects as well, so that's also really, really important. And it's a tool among others. The most important thing is the mindset. And this just helps us structure those thoughts that come from that mindset. And in fieldwork, especially anthropologists, and luckily also many designers also follow a strict code. Don't lie to people being maybe number one. People should know what you are doing and why, not be studied in secret and used without their consent. And I know many people use these kind of canvases, they have them. So this is one example of a concrete action that you can do. And why should you do something? This quote comes from Tatiana Mack, who presented at the Joint Futures Conference just pre-COVID when we still had live conferences. But I found this super powerful. Just to know that intent does not erase impact. We did not intend for that to happen is something we all probably hear quite a lot, especially from the larger tech companies. And of course, we can't erase the possibility of that happening altogether. But what we can do is carefully assess the possible consequences of our choices and actions. Not just for the benefit of business, although inclusivity does make for good business as well. But I'm a bit of an idealist and like to think that we as people could and should do these things just for the sake of them being decent. But to repeat, it is good business. anthropology teaches its practitioners to critically look at their own world and own assumptions by studying, among others, those who do things differently. And that is something we designers can and should do as well. Self-reflection, I'm immersing ourselves in the worlds of others, and perhaps most of all, just listening. And if you don't know even who you should be listening to and can't figure it out by yourself, maybe just ask. That's what I like to do as well. There are always people or organizations who can guide you forward kind of in the right direction, kind of teach you how to take control of that thought process yourselves as well. Yeah, I think the Designing for Children or Inklusiiv are both excellent examples for this. I think I'm already out of time, so thanks for listening to my rant. I suppose do I have time for a couple of questions still?
Thank you, Sanna. That was super engaging. I kind of, you're bringing nicely forward that like we are living in a world of norms and standards and double standards. And also the point that you were making about that, well, we designers are not saviors, and inclusive design is not just a nice thing to do to other people. Even that would be kind of speaking from a place of privilege, kind of the point that this is not a problem to me. So do you point out any kind of privileges or these kinds of places from people talk in your daily work, or when you are working with, for instance, stakeholders, or what would be the kind of ways that you use to kind of wake people up and bring them from their own comfort zone?
Yeah, good question. There are actually a lot of ways, but I think most of it is just about conversation and kind of having had that conversation quite a few times already, so that you can like insert it into a conversation really easily already. But I think it needs to come from a place of common understanding, and that is quite important to know, that you need to also understand the place where the other people are coming from, to kind of know how to have that talk and have that talk be impactful. So you can't basically you can charge in and tell them you need to do this, but that's usually not the best option.
Yes, of course. It's also about the psychological safety in these spaces. There's a question from Lassi. So the question of who to recruit in user research is very important, as in the reality of the resources are limited. So for instance, if you could only recruit 10 people to test Koronavirkku or such surveys that is used by a really wide audience of users, who would you recruit? How would you start kind of unpacking this?
I'm sure a lot of people here at Solita could answer that, since they made that. I don't have a quick answer for this. I think I would say it also depends on the context, really, like a lot. That who are you designing for, and who are you trying to bring into the service? Koronavirkku is a really good example, because it's supposed to be for the whole Finnish people. So I think that is a tricky question that would require for me to actually know a little something about that process. But yeah, it's always about the kind of like the context that we want to work with.
Yeah, for sure. Like a consultant would say, it depends.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for our final keynote, and after that we have a small wrap up with the whole gang. But now I would like to give the stage to Yesmith, and as I would say, take it on.
Thank you. And well, today I'm going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in design, and what is that we actually need in order to what we need to consider for inclusive design. Sorry, I was distracted by my own voice. But I'm going to first, as Lassi promised, I will speak a little bit about Inklusiiv as an organization. So we are both an organization and a company, and we have as a mission to both create and share knowledge around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And why this is important is because this is knowledge, of course, that we are not sort of reinventing or inventing, but it's actually knowledge that exists and that is evolving over time. And what we want to do is to create it for Finland, of course, and then very importantly, we also want to support organizations in to actually create change with focus on these areas, which are diversity, equity, and inclusion. A little bit about myself. My name is Yesmith Sánchez, and I am originally from Mexico, but I have been living in Finland for 14 years. So I would consider myself, I am also a Finn. But also a fair disclaimer, I am not a designer. I am a business strategist. And as I said, I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. I don't dare saying I am an expert because I think this is the very topic in which you would never be really there and then that you would know it all. But that as a background. Now I thought we could start by saying, what do we actually mean by inclusive design? And one of the reasons I always like to talk about everything or any topic that I talk about and then go to the very key concept is because sometimes, and also this is part of how we assume topics, is that we just assume that people understand what the concepts actually mean. But if we actually take a step back and we talk about what inclusive design actually means, if we go to the definition by the British Standard Institute, the inclusive design is the design of mainstream products and services that are designed in such fashion that are accessible to and usable by as many possible people, and then that you succeed to actually have them accessible for these people, that they feel like they can use them, and that they can just feel compelled to go for it. But also this inclusive design is not universal design, and it's also about when you design these products and services that the most or the majority of people would be able to have access to them without the need of actually making any specific adaptation themselves, or that the product would need any adaptation by itself. So with that said, I would also like to start with a statement, which is building inclusive digital and any other products, but also services, contributes to actually building more inclusive societies for all. And why is that? Is because when we are creating products and when we are designing them, we are actually having an impact on how we actually see and consider what others may be seeing. So think about, for example, the possibility of looking at a website, something super simple. If you think about websites that are accessible, for example, or that take the aspect of accessibility into consideration, and then you suddenly see that they may have the option for listening for people who may have weak sight or something of the sort, or that they have the option to actually enlarging the text, or for people who may have perhaps different learning abilities, that they have summarized versions of these things. Even by seeing these products that have been designed into taking into consideration other audiences that are not just the what we are seeing as the majority, actually makes us think about these other people who may be seeing things from different perspectives and from different angles. So we are having an impact, no matter how little or how big, when we are designing inclusive products. And of course, it has the biggest impact for those who can access it but would not otherwise be able to do so. So on this note, what is important to also talk about is what is actually the target of inclusive design? Who are we actually targeting? And if you're thinking, of course, about specialized products, they are very specific in the market and they are very niche. But when we talk about the target of inclusive design, if we take this pyramid as a context, what we can see is that perhaps 21% of the population we would be designing for have zero difficulties, and then the 16% has minimal difficulties, and then 37% will have mild difficulties. But the target of inclusive design is to go to people who actually have severe difficulties without actually going to the very top. Why so? Because if we were to be designing a product that is specific for people who may have severe difficulties, then that may be a specialized product. Nonetheless, as I was saying, the aim and the goal of inclusive design is to be as accessible and as usable as possible by as many people as possible as well. With this in mind, what we need to think about when we are designing products and services that are inclusive, what we need to bear in mind is that we cannot rely on being very inclusive on one part of the process, but then forgetting another one. In this sense, think about all of the stages of the design of that product, and actually from the very ideation to actually going to the end user. Are you actually taking into consideration everyone and all the aspects that have to do with inclusion and how to actually acknowledge diversity? So with this, we are talking about oftentimes with very good intentions. When we think about inclusive design, we think a lot about it in the development and design phase, but we should actually be thinking about it already from the planning, and then of course in the testing and iteration, and then nonetheless, even when we launch it, and then of course when we are receiving feedback by the end users, and even from people who is not using it but is able to spot some weak lines or some areas of opportunity in our design. But if we're talking about that there are things that are preventing us from actually designing things in an inclusive fashion, or actually that we are just overlooking things, and this is something that already Sanna, Jonna, and Jesse, they have already referred to, that oftentimes, unbeknownst to us, or something that we may not even take into consideration, we are not being inclusive enough when it comes to designing. So what is that is preventing us from actually doing that? There are several barriers to inclusion in design as they are in the society. Inclusion in itself is a universe, but if you think about it from the perspective of design, then oftentimes what happens also at a societal level when we fail when it comes to inclusion is that we tend to overlook diversity. And what happens is that, and this is retaking on the words that Sanna was mentioning, that sometimes we can't see these things just because we are in a privileged position, and there isn't anything wrong about our privileges. We just have them, but it is important to be aware of them so that we can possibly do something about it, and then acknowledge that not everyone sees the same things, and that not everyone experiences the same situations than we do. So overlooking diversity is one of those barriers that can actually happen. Then group thinking is also something that happens, especially when you do not have a diverse team, which is also contributing to the design of products or services. What happens is that you just end up actually agreeing to ideas, and there isn't anything wrong. Of course, at some point you need to agree, but are you not being challenged at all? Have you ever considered that sometimes people are very proud and they say, like, we are actually a very good team, there is no conflict, and actually we are voted as the best working place. But then if you think, if the group is homogeneous, of course they are happy. But would it be as happy place for someone who would be different or who would be having another perspective? This is something that we want to think about. Another one is, of course, sometimes we rely heavily on data, but is our data unbiased when we are talking about it? It has been proved that even algorithms can be biased because, of course, the data that we are providing is what is ultimately going to have an effect on what we are actually designing and the decisions that we are making. Then another one that has to do is we tend to sometimes overlook the end users. And this is also related to what Jonna was saying. We may be designing our product for a certain population, but the reality is that it may be used by something or someone else. So I don't know for whom TikTok was designed for example, but I am sure that it took a very different angle when the pandemic came, and then perhaps people my age and people in my situation would start to get more use of it. I did not, but what I was trying to say is that perhaps it went from a very young population to actually people being even the age of those people that originally were using the app. So we may not consider those scenarios, and that may be dangerous because then we are actually not thinking about how that can affect. And this actually returns to, for example, children. Maybe when I designed my game, when I designed my, I don't know, my tables at the restaurant, maybe I was thinking at someone with body able, or maybe someone with average height or whatever. But what happens to children, what happens to people who are actually also going to have access to this, and what is the experience that they are having? Another one has to do with lack of training and awareness. And this is something that when we are designing or when we are doing anything, as I was saying, I am a business strategist. And in anything you do in life, when you are not aware of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what happens is that you tend to overlook that. And I'm not saying that you're doing it because you are a bad person or because you don't care about it. It's simply because we do not know how to actually integrate it in our daily work. And that is an issue. And that can often be triggered by some unconscious biases. Unconscious biases are those assumptions that are so very embedded in us that we no longer question or even see them. And sometimes, even if we acknowledge them, it's just the way we react, and we no longer sort of wonder why that is happening. Of course, in that case, they become conscious biases, but the point is we do have them. It's human nature, no shame on having them, but how we actually address them and what we actually do about them is important. And why that is important is because biases hinder us from building inclusive services and products. And if we think from a purely monetary point of view, this actually is also preventing organizations from thriving and from reaching, for example, wider audiences and reaching new markets and whatnot. But when we are actually also not acknowledging our biases, we are at the risk of discrimination and at the risk of not acknowledging that we have audiences that we are not catering for and that we are just leaving a very large group of the population. And those biases are everywhere, as, for example, again, Jonna and Sanna were referring, sometimes it has to do with the rhetorics, sometimes it has to do with the words we are choosing, the images that we are choosing, and altogether, at the end, when we have the final product, they can have some consequences of leaving people behind. And in some cases, it's not just about excluding a certain market or not being appealing for all, but it actually may have even life-threatening consequences. So, for example, when people were testing the safety of cars with dummies that were designed for mostly tall men, then it didn't have anything to do with children. It didn't have anything to do with, for example, an average-sized woman as me. It had life-threatening consequences of not taking into consideration these aspects when it came to the design. And then in some other cases, for example, when it came to the soap dispensers, you just overlook the fact that not all skins are white. And then if you have dark skin, you are not even able to get soap at a hotel toilet. So those kinds of things, some are uncomfortable, some you just do not reach audiences, and some are not only discriminatory, but also life-threatening. And of course, as I was saying, if we think about it from a very perspective of monetary consequences, we are overlooking a potential market, and we are overlooking the possibility of actually iterating our products so that we can remain available and that we can remain as relevant in markets. But there are several biases that exist. I picked only 4 today because they are quite common when it comes to, for example, digital service development, and I thought that we could go through them, and then I could exemplify how they actually look like when it comes to designing services and products. So the first one is confirmation bias. This bias is something that perhaps we see every day, and it is the search of validation in order to confirm what we already believe. So in that sense, if I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is good, perhaps I just search for information that actually confirms that. In this case, that is a truth. But what I'm trying to say is that, am I being challenged by people? Are actually people questioning me when I am saying that this is important if I am not having that actual people who are challenging me, how am I about to learn more, and how am I about to actually understand that not everyone gets the same message. But when it comes to designing products and when it comes to confirmation bias, sometimes we have ideas and then we pitch them. And then if we face reluctance, we just kind of tend to think like, it's because they don't get it. But then we search for that person that is actually going to validate our idea, and so that we can carry on with it. This is very common, and no shame on it, but it's also very dangerous, because if we are just seeking for people who are going to confirm and not also to confront us, then it may lead us into just designing something that more or less is something of a dream of us. And that is actually also related to conformity bias. Oftentimes, when we are very much in love with our ideas, we tend to try very hard to convince people. And sometimes people have the tendency to actually act or just agree with you ultimately. And then it doesn't matter if their personal belief is something else, but actually after a while, you tend to conform to whatever, for example, something everyone else is saying. So let's say that I am in a committee of designing a product, and let's actually think about, for example, planning the buses and how they actually open. And then let's say that I'm talking only with very able people, and then perhaps they are single, perhaps they are very young. And then when they are thinking like, it doesn't matter, it looks cool to make it a little bit taller. It looks nice, and then maybe it's not so hard to drive the bus or whatnot. But then if I were a mother and I was using a pram to carry my baby, and then I say like, but actually this should be lower because we need to put the prams inside. And then the other people are saying like, but we can help you lift it. So after some point, sometimes you do not have the energy to actually fight for your point. And then you're like, yeah, well, fine. Maybe someone will help me lifting the pram. And then you just sort of conform to what everyone else is saying, not necessarily because it represents with what you are thinking, but because everyone else is so sold into the idea that you actually start questioning yourself whether you are just trying to be difficult or something of the sort. Another common bias is illusory correlation, and this is actually also related to what we have heard in the 3 keynotes before, and this is assuming that one factor about a person correlates to another one. And this has to do, for example, and this is something that Sanna was talking about, that sometimes we assume that people don't know anything about technology, or like people in their 70s just don't know how to access Netflix, let's say. This is dangerous because we are making an assumption, perhaps, if I were deciding based on that, because I know how it is, how the experience is for my father. But making those assumptions is dangerous, and why we need to actually consider the aspects of inclusion is because whether we know or not someone from that target that we are trying to think about, we do not know the universe still that they may represent. So it is important to not have those illusory correlations. Of course, our knowledge is important, and the knowledge that we have about that specific audience that we are trying to cater for is something that we don't need to disregard, but it is also important to acknowledge that we do not possess the full truth. And then the last bias that I picked for this session, it is around availability heuristic, which is the tendency to think about things that are coming to our mind easily are the most important ones. And this is actually more dangerous now, more than ever, when we are so connected through our telephones, through our social media, through our computers, that oftentimes, for example, we are seeing articles that just confirm the things that we are talking about all the time. That is just how the algorithms are designed. It's how it works. And so if we are actually just having like, yes, I read this article, and then it is actually also related to the confirmation bias. The information that you are having is important, of course, and it is nice to have it, and it is nice that it's available, but you should dig deeper in order to have more educated decision making. And like this, there are plenty of others. I just picked these four because I thought it would be important to bring some concrete examples. But oftentimes, also what is very common when it comes to the design of products and services is, for example, the bias called sunk cost bias, which has to do with the fact that when you have already invested energy and money onto something, and even more if you really care about this, sometimes even if deep in your heart you know you are not going on the right path, you refuse to let go because you are so very invested in it. And like this, there are several other examples. So what can we actually do to reduce our biases? Because they exist, they will be there, that's just how our brain works. But what can we do actually to reduce them when we are designing products and services? Well, I have the 5 steps to reduce your biases in digital service and product development. And one of them is to have diversity, equity, and inclusion as a core value. So this is not just something that you are actually like, okay, I'm going to do something inclusive about it. But it has to be in your culture, it has to be in the way you think, and as I was mentioning, it has to be going throughout the process. Another one is to actually learn and identify that we do have those biases. So if I have a tendency, as Jesse was saying, to be just talking to Jesse because he agrees with me, am I actually doing right? Am I being challenged? Am I actually just not even seeking for different opinions? Another one very important is to have a diverse team. It doesn't matter how aware we are of our biases. If we do not have the perspectives, we are not going to be able to see things. We just can't see what we don't see, and we cannot do anything about it. We need diversity, matter of fact. Another one is to be always customer-centric. And as Jesse was also mentioning, we are designing for humans. And when we are thinking about it, we have to think about the peculiarities that we are going to encounter and give them the importance that they require. And then also this revisiting what Sanna was saying is, let's be mindful about the language, the words, the colors, the pictures, the general rhetoric that we are using, because it has an impact in what people are perceiving. It doesn't matter if we mean well. If we are overemphasizing, for example, the race of someone, we are tokenizing, and this is actually dangerous, and it goes against the very principles of being inclusive. So these are the 5 steps. And with that in mind, I also would like to make you think when you are designing something. Are you questioning yourself? Are you, for example, asking yourself, like, am I using the right data? Am I using the right imagery? Am I using the right language? Is this accessible to everyone or to the most possible people? Can anyone use it? Is it for anyone? And then, of course, always think about how to be mitigating those biases that may be presenting. Furthermore, very importantly, always test it when it's actually going to be the final customers. Sometimes we love things, they look very nice, but what do the customers actually say? I, for example, tend to speak a lot about these things, and then I go very easily into very high level, and then I sort of lost people. You always have to check in time and time again. Are people following you? Are you still catering for them, or are you self-serving? And with this, I would like to say that everyone is prone to overlook aspects of inclusion, no shame. This is just what happens. This happens in daily life, but it also happens, of course, when we are designing a product or a service. And as I was saying, it's going to happen. We are prone to do so. So what we are going to do is we need to rely on processes and feedback so that we are less prone to actually make decisions that are going to be biased. And that is it for me. I would like to recommend for you some reading. This is not specific about design, but this is about bias and how they affect our ways of thinking and conducting ourselves. These are some of the very few readings that you could have. We also at Inklusiiv have a resource bank that is open for all, and it's, I am biased to say it perhaps, but it's actually very good. It's well curated, and it has different aspects that you may want to learn more about. And that is it for me. You can find us on social media, and then you can always ask questions and actually challenge us in our beliefs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yesmith. That was enlightening. I can say that I am also biased, but I don't care. The resources that Inklusiiv has to offer for everyone for free are stellar. I could ask one question from you, Yesmith, as you kind of had the business strategist point of view here. I'm sure you have seen many organizations and different shifts in their cultures within. Can you share or tell like what kinds of actions have you seen in organizations after they have maybe become more aware of their biases that are possibly embedded in their product strategies or these kinds of more high level things? What kind of changes or reactions have you witnessed?
That's a good question. Of course, everyone says that when they answer a question, but I actually think this one is very, very good one and enriching from the sense that it, of course, is very different depending on the customer and things of the sort. But what I think is the most common reaction is that usually it hits like a wave, and then people are a little bit overwhelmed by, oh, wow, this is all that I should be thinking about. But at the end of the day, what is good news is that they also actually sort of, when the information sinks in, and then they have already acknowledged that, okay, this is a full wave, but I have to take it one at a time. That I think that what organizations most likely will do is that they will sit down and define what are the priorities. And I always say, as a consultant and also as a person that actually cares about the change to happen, I always encourage people not to try to solve the full problem. It's not going to happen. So go for one chunk at a time so that you can see progress and you don't lose your motivation. So I guess that is what happens, that people acknowledge the priorities and then they go for it step to step. And I also think that the more knowledgeable you become about this topic, the more you realize you have to do. So sometimes people get overwhelmed, I have to admit.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this ties in or feeds into one of the questions that we had from the audience. From Mikael, that would be, how would you advise the stakeholders about the topic as well? Priorities is surely one thing, but what would be the kind of things that you would present that would kind of tickle the brains of stakeholders or people in leadership positions? Any thoughts?
Yes, thank you for the question, Michael. Mikael, sorry. It's actually a matter of inclusion to pronounce names right. I apologize. I do think that what is important is to actually, when we are approaching a design product, a product design or a service design, that we actually bring up that diversity or inclusion is an aspect that we're going to be taking into consideration. First, also, for example, if we are doing it for a client, so that we actually raise this importance. And also, when we are sharing it, for example, with the final users, we actually tell them consciously, we have designed this with the idea that this will be catering for as many people as possible. Does this serve the purpose? And then I think also when it comes to not only advise stakeholders, but actually also put some accountability in them. So this is not only about being aware, but it's actually also about doing something about it. I do not know whether I managed to answer your question, Mikael, but I hope I did.
I can add on that. I think, like if I think about organizations and the sort of maturity in these topics, it's one thing to have it in your strategy and to really say that we are inclusive and we include the children or so on, and having positive impact, but then actually to really be able to transform the organization so that it's in the processes, it is actually in the incentives, it's actually in the ways of working and in the thinking, in the sort of organizational atmosphere that whatever role you are in the organization, you sort of breathe. As a trainee, you are able to have the inclusive approach, or often the challenge many organizations have, that if the new strategy is stating that we want to be sustainable and inclusive, socially and environmentally sustainable, then the challenge is that the sales incentives are not changed, or that some other thing is not changed, and it's actually hindering the organization to really live through the strategy and provide what they really want to. And I think it is then we come to the complexity of the social system of the organization. So it's not easy, but it's doable. But you just need to sort of map out where you are as an organization and who are sort of the change makers inside the organization. Because often, for example, if I think about just the designing for children point of view, it might be that in the design team, there are people who are fully aware and want to do this, but it's not the business, for example, is not yet there. And it just needs to be, there needs to be dialogue, and there needs to be sort of transparency, I think, in this. But sorry, long rant.
A bit off track, but to comment both on the Yesmith and Jonna's comments. When we talk about diversity and inclusion in companies nowadays, it is really prevalent and present, yes, but it is often focused still on gender and both on like the female-male spectrum. And that is hugely important, yes. Like Yesmith said, you have to start somewhere. You have to kind of know where to begin. And that is a thing that affects half the world's population. So it's super important. But it should we should all keep in mind that that is not all that there is. There is so much more to consider, except for the gender inequalities as well.
And just to elaborate on that, I think that even when we speak about gender, there is a very huge diversity for that very aspect of intersectionality that Jesse was mentioning. I may not be experiencing the world in the same way, even if I am body able, if I am highly educated. When I am a woman of color in Finland, that already shapes my experience very differently. So gender is an aspect. We should care about it. We should always care to be inclusive to all genders, but it is not it. There are several aspects.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess like another off-track point, but still in the spectrum of what we're talking about. I think we still have this kind of a notion that people should accommodate to technology. You know, the feeling that you might feel ashamed if you cannot use a product or service or cannot figure out how the streaming platform works. So that's kind of the thing that I still kind of catch myself into thinking. And what do you think about that? How, or are you seeing the world going to a direction where people are not conforming to technology, and where there might be people that acknowledge this even though they might themselves try to conform and be ashamed that they cannot use something? Because we are kind of humans designing things for humans. So random thought, but can you catch my drift?
Super important and interesting thought in that when we think about technology in general, it's not separate from us. Kind of, we live with technology, it affects us, we affect it, we change the world with it, and it changes the world a bit. So it's kind of like this ongoing process of actors that are all doing something in the world. So of course that process is ever changing, and not sure if I know how to answer your question in that. I just had to point that out. But what you talk about, the shame about not being able to use something, is at least highly prevalent on what I mentioned in the elderly. And that's a lot due to the fact that how we talk as well, like how we talk about the subject. So I think chasing the discourse also changes the attitudes a bit.
I think it's also like, are you allowed to use the technology? Like, is it accessible in a sense that does it work with the old phones, or I think yesterday you were mentioning it, or like it was anyway like a relevant in all of the talks, like what is accessibility. It's not only that everybody can use the same website with different impairments or different, but it's also like the like global angle. Is your service only for you or only for Finland, or is it also for people who have different kind of devices?
Definitely.
I was going to say, I was just recently in Mexico, and then I realized that because of the COVID situation and because of the amount of people, you have to be more careful about like the contact and everything. But then I realized that everything moved to digital. And I was thinking, like, in a country with such economical inequalities, how dare you demanding from, for example, bank customers to have a smartphone? It's not even feasible. I can't even imagine who was designing that and deciding that that would be imperative. I was dismayed. I do have a smartphone, but I refuse to use it just for out of principle.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the aspects of, even in Finland, what I mentioned about being like a digital native, that people expect for certain age teenagers already to have. Everyone has a smartphone, everyone can work with a smartphone, and that is just not the case.
Yeah, and that might be also one of the things that kind of is transmitted through the tech community. If we think about our Christian society in Finland and the golden rule that treat others the way you would want to be treated. So I guess like one of the turning points for me was this notion of the platinum rule, which is treat others the way they want to be treated. So that's kind of a simple rule that instantly takes me from my kind of point of view and my notion of reality and kind of makes me a better designer, a better human, and maybe a better business person. So kind of it all comes down to not acting on my own needs and assumptions.
It's a good point.
I guess we are closing into 2 hours. We have 2 hours of awesome content here that will be available after the stream in YouTube as well. And we are not planning to do a great sparkling grand finale here because the work is not done. We are not ending our jobs and efforts into this webinar because this is just the kind of beginning. This is one way to start discussions and bring new perspectives that we hope that you there at homes and at offices and wherever you are looking at this would maybe get something, get some new thoughts, help you to start discussions. And at this point, I would like to thank Jonna, Sanna, Yesmith for coming together to sharing your thoughts and making this happen. It's truly been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
See ya and be safe.
Bye. Bye.